The warship Undying Patience moved through deep space, like a slow scar crossing the black. Its hull was the color of iron, its engines barely made a sound, and the 140 soldiers aboard it had learned long ago that silence on this ship meant something unusual was coming. Commander Zetharak stood at the main viewport with his arms folded behind his back and stared at the stars. He had 4 arms, dark green scales across the flat planes of his face, and 2 sets of yellow eyes that almost never blinked. 30 years in the Varick Dominion fleet had made him disciplined, patient, and nearly impossible to frighten. Nearly. The message from High Command had arrived 3 hours before. It was short and written in the flat military language that never softened anything. 1 human soldier, designation Corporal Mara Holt, would be joining his unit for the joint ground operation on the contested jungle world of Kale 4. The mission was to recover a downed recon beacon from behind enemy lines. Standard enough, except for the human. Zetharak read her file twice. Then he called his senior officers into the briefing room. They arrived quickly. Scholar 10, the unit's biologist, a thin creature with 6 fingers on each hand, and a habit of writing everything down. Warlord Sarek, the oldest officer on the ship, covered in faded battle marks from a dozen campaigns. Lieutenant Vhex, young and sharp-eyed, who sat at the end of the table and said nothing unless it mattered. Zetharak put Holt's file on the central table and let them read. Sarek finished first. He set down the file, leaned back in his chair, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "She's Grimspawn." The word moved through the room like cold air. Grimspawn. That was what the older generations of alien soldiers called humans. Not as an insult exactly, but as a kind of warning wrapped inside a name. It had started during the First Contact period, when the wider galaxy had tried to make sense of what humans actually were. The results of that effort had been deeply unsettling for every species that had undertaken it. Scholar 10 pulled up his research terminal and began reading aloud, not because anyone asked him to, but because he found comfort in data when everything else felt unsteady. Humans are the only known species in the cataloged galaxy, 10 began, whose primary biological response to extreme danger is to move toward the source of that danger rather than away from it. Their adrenal system floods their body with a chemical compound that suppresses pain signals, increases muscle output by up to 40%, and in some documented cases causes them to experience what they describe as a feeling of calm. Lieutenant Vhex looked up from the file. Calm? Calm, 10 confirmed. They call it focus. Sarek tapped the table once, with 1 thick finger. I fought alongside a human unit during the Reth Corridor campaign 12 years ago. We were pinned under direct fire for 6 hours. By the 4th hour, my soldiers were beginning to shut down from stress response. The humans were making jokes. No one said anything to that. 10 continued reading. He talked about human wound recovery, which was faster than any soft tissue species had any right to achieve. Sleep cycles, which were short and aggressive, as though their bodies treated rest as a logistics problem to solve, rather than a need to be honored. He talked about the HFY War, a 3-decade conflict between humanity and the Varathi Empire, which the Varathi had entered expecting a quick campaign against a young species, and had exited as a broken civilization. Not because the humans had outgunned them, but because they had simply refused to stop fighting, long after any reasonable species would have accepted defeat and moved on. They domesticated fire, 10 said at one point, more to himself than to the room. Voluntarily, they took a force of pure destruction and decided to keep it close to them and use it every day. Vhex stared at him. What does that have to do with anything? 10 looked up from his screen. It tells you how they think. The briefing continued, but the tone of it had shifted from military planning into something else. Closer to a group of intelligent beings, trying to locate the edges of a thing they did not fully understand. They were not afraid, exactly, or at least none of them would use the word. But there was a careful, attentive quality in the room that had not been there before the file was placed on the table. Zetharak let them talk. He had learned over 3 decades that sometimes the most useful thing a commander could do was stand still and let the people around him work through their own thinking. He would steer when it was necessary, and not before. After an hour he ended the meeting. He told his officers to prepare the ship for the humans' arrival, to ensure her quarters were stocked with the protein and liquid ratios listed in the file, and to behave with the same professionalism they would extend to any allied soldier from any species in the Dominion. The docking bay of the Undying Patience was the loudest part of the ship on most days. Cargo lifts running, fuel lines connecting, soldiers moving between stations in the long, echoing space between the walls. But when the transport from the human relay station locked into the docking collar, and the bay doors sealed shut behind it, the noise stopped. It did not fade, it stopped, as though every person in the bay made the same decision at the same moment, without speaking to each other about it. There were 22 soldiers standing in that bay, Commander Zetharak at the front, Sarek and Vex on either side of him, the rest arranged in a loose arc that looked professional from a distance, but was actually just 20 people, quietly making sure they were not standing at the very front of it. The transport ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss. Corporal Mara Holt walked down it. She was not what most of the alien soldiers had been expecting. Them had talked openly about what they were expecting, because that would have required admitting they had been expecting something. But if they had been completely honest with themselves, they might have said they were imagining something larger, or louder, or surrounded by some visible quality that matched the reputation that had preceded her arrival. She was medium height, compact, broad at the shoulders, with short dark hair, and the kind of face that did not give much away. She wore standard-issue human tactical gear that had clearly seen real use, marked by the small scars and worn patches that only come from actual field conditions, rather than training exercises. She had a half-eaten ration bar in her left hand, and she was finishing it as she came down the ramp, chewing without hurry. She reached the bottom and looked at the assembled group in front of her. "Commander Zetharak," she said. "Corporal Holt," he said. "Welcome aboard the Undying Patience." "Thank you, sir," she said. She tucked the empty ration wrapper into a side pocket with a clean, practiced motion. "Sorry about the timing on the manifest note. I sent ahead, but I'm not sure it went through correctly. Is there a problem with Duke?" "Duke," Zetharak said. "My dog," she said. She glanced back up the ramp. "He doesn't like travel crates. I kept him loose in the cabin. He should be right behind me." The bay was very quiet. Then the second figure came down the ramp. It did not rush. It moved the way large things move when they have nothing to prove to anyone and nowhere urgent to be. Each step deliberate and measured, the nails clicking softly against the metal of the ramp. The enormous head held low and forward, scanning the room below in a single slow sweep that missed nothing. Duke stood nearly a meter at the shoulder. He was built like something that should not exist, and in fact, legally, should not have. Given that the gene splice program that produced him had been banned by Earth's Colonial Science Authority 40 years prior, after the animals it created were deemed to exceed acceptable parameters for civilian ownership in every category that mattered. His body was wide and dense with muscle, under a coat of black fur shot through with streaks of dark gray. His skull was broad and heavy, the kind of skull that appeared to have been engineered for a specific and serious purpose. His legs were thick, each one roughly the size of a grown Varric soldier's arm. His jaws were closed, but the shape of them told a clear enough story to anyone paying attention. His eyes were amber, pale gold at the center, and they moved across the assembled soldiers with an intelligence that was quiet, patient, and completely without warmth. Not hostile exactly, but the kind of calm that sits on the other side of many difficult experiences. He reached the bottom of the ramp and sat down beside Holt. Not because she commanded him, she had not said a single word, but because that was simply where he had decided to be. One of the young Varric soldiers at the back of the ark made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and took one step backward, without appearing to notice he had done it. Scholar 10, standing to Zetharac's left, had gone completely still. His six-fingered hands were flat against his sides, unmoving. His eyes were fixed on Duke, with an expression that, in his species, indicated the processing of information, that the brain was not yet ready to file under any existing category. Duke looked at 10. 10 did not move. Duke looked away. A young soldier near the right side of the ark. His name was Corporal Weth, 19 years old, recently graduated from the Varric Military Academy with high marks in combat theory, raised his weapon, not fully, not aimed, just lifted it with the instinct of a trained soldier, responding to something his body had classified as a threat before his mind had fully caught up to the decision. Duke's amber eyes moved to him immediately, slow and exact, carrying no panic and no hesitation. Just attention, the kind that does not need to announce itself to be felt across a room. Holt said, "Don't." The word was flat and quiet. It landed in the room like a dropped weight. Weth froze, weapon half raised, and it was not entirely clear to anyone watching, including Zetharac, whether Holt had been speaking to the soldier or to the animal beside her. Duke did not move. He had not moved at all through any of this. He simply continued to look at Weth with those pale gold eyes, until the soldier slowly, very carefully, lowered his weapon back to his side. The War Council chamber, on the Undying Patience, was not a large room. It had a long table, 12 chairs, a wall-mounted display screen, and a standing lamp in the corner that had been broken for 2 years, and that nobody had fixed, because nobody wanted to be the one to admit they had walked into it. It was a room built for decisions, not for the kind of conversation that Zetharac was about to have in it. He called the meeting 2 hours after Holt and Duke had been escorted to their quarters. The message to his senior officers was short. Briefing room now, not related to the mission. They came quickly. Sarek sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. He was doing the thing he always did when he was thinking carefully, which was to look at a fixed point on the wall and simply not move. Vhex sat beside him, with a datapad he was not actually reading. Scholar 10 arrived last, carrying 3 separate data files, and looking like a being who had not slept recently, and was not planning to. "The animal," Zetharac said, once everyone was seated. There was no need to specify which animal. There was only one animal on this ship, and everyone in this room had thought about nothing else for the last 2 hours. 10 opened the first file immediately. He had been waiting for someone to say the word. Designation: Canis lupus familiaris, Ursus arctos hybridus, first-generation splice, he began, reading from the screen in the steady, careful voice he used when data was the most solid thing in the room. Produced between the years 2089 and 2104 by the Helios Colonial Gene Science Division, as part of a program to create large-body companion and working animals for deep colony environments where standard domestic animals could not survive the environmental pressure. The program was terminated in 2104 when the Colonial Science Authority ruled that the resulting animals exceeded acceptable parameters for civilian ownership, specifically in the categories of size, jaw pressure, territorial instinct, and, he paused and looked up at the room, problem-solving ability. Vhex looked up from his datapad. Problem-solving ability. The animals were observed modifying their environment to achieve outcomes they wanted, 10 said. In one documented case, a specimen learned to open the coded lock on its enclosure by watching its handler enter the sequence. The animal watched this happen over the course of 1 week, without being taught, without being encouraged. It simply watched, and then it did it. The room absorbed this. "How large do they get?" Sarek asked. He was still looking at the wall. Duke is within normal range for his type, 10 said. Approximately 94 kilograms. Jaw pressure of around 850 kilograms per square centimeter. For reference, the jaw pressure of a standard Varric combat hound is approximately 340. Sarek moved his eyes very slowly from the wall to 10. And she keeps it in her quarters. She keeps it in her quarters, 10 confirmed. No one said anything for a moment. I want to be clear about something, Vex said. He set the datapad down flat on the table. Coalition Regulation 417 states that all non-registered fauna aboard a Dominion vessel must be reported to command and assessed for threat classification before being permitted in crew quarters or common areas. This animal has not been assessed. It has not been registered. It has not been classified under any category in the Dominion standard framework. Who in this room would like to do the assessment? Zetharak asked. Vex looked at the table surface in front of him. I'm raising a procedural point, sir, not volunteering. Then we will note the procedural point, Zetharak said, and we will move on. He nodded at 10 to continue. Biologist pulled up the second file. This one was not about Duke specifically, but about Earth fauna in general, and the information inside it did not make anyone in the room feel any better about anything. 10 walked through the list with the steady voice of someone reading a damage report after a battle. Wolves, which humans had domesticated into hundreds of distinct breeds over 14,000 years, and which now lived inside human homes and slept beside human children. Large cats, which humans kept in private residences in several regions of Earth, despite these animals being fully capable of killing a grown adult without significant effort. Reptilians of the crocodilian family, which could remain completely motionless for hours and then move faster than most species could track with their eyes. Marine predators that had survived 5 separate mass extinction events and were still present in human oceans, which humans regularly entered for what their own documents described as recreation. Recreation, Sarek said. Not as a question, just as a word placed flat on the table like a piece of evidence. Swimming, 10 said. Surfing, diving. Several humans have been documented returning voluntarily to the same bodies of water after surviving an attack from these animals in that exact location. Sarek said nothing to that. He returned his eyes to the fixed point on the wall. Warlord Sarek had, over the course of his career, stood on the bridges of 3 burning ships, survived a close-range detonation that removed the left side of a building he was standing inside, and once walked for 9 hours through a frozen mountain pass with a fractured limb because the extraction shuttle was on the other side of it. He did not consider himself a being who struggled with difficult information, but the expression on his face right now was the expression of a being quietly revising something that he had previously considered settled. The problem, Zetharak said, steering the conversation back toward the point of the meeting, is not what Duke is. The problem is what he is not. He is not listed as a weapon. Corporal Holt has not designated him as tactical support or a combat asset. In her own words, spoken in this bay 2 hours ago, he is her dog, which means Coalition Regulation 417 covers threat classification for registered fauna, weapons, and combat assets, and Duke does not fit cleanly inside any of these categories. Because she loves it, Vex said. He said it with the flat tone of someone stating a fact they found genuinely difficult to process. She doesn't think of it as dangerous, she thinks of it as a companion, and somehow that makes it impossible to classify under any system we have. Yes. Zetharak said. The room went quiet again. Then a message came through on Zetharak's communicator. He read it a second time. Then he looked up at his officers with the expression of a man who had decided to simply deliver information without adding any commentary to it. There is a report from Deck 7, he said. The crew mess hall. Sarek turned to look at him. Duke found the mess hall, Zetharak said. He located the protein ration storage unit. He is currently sitting in front of it, waiting. 3 of our soldiers are standing outside the mess hall door and have declined to re-enter the room. Nobody laughed. It was not quite a laughing situation. But Vex made a very small sound that might have been, in a completely different context, the beginning of amusement. Zetharox stood from his chair. "I'll inform Corporal Holt." He found her in the corridor outside the mess hall. She was already on her way, apparently, because someone on Deck 7 had sent her a message directly. She reached the door ahead of Zetharak, opened it without pausing, stepped inside, and came out 2 minutes later with Duke walking calmly beside her, his tail moving in a low, easy swing. Kale 4 was the kind of world that did not want visitors. Its jungle had been growing for millions of years and had moved past the point of being merely alive into something closer to aggressive. The trees were enormous, their roots lifting out of the dark soil in wide arching shapes that soldiers had to climb over or duck under. The air was heavy and wet and tasted like green things rotting slowly into more green things. Visibility in most directions dropped to under 10 meters, and in some places to under 5. The squad dropped from the transport at 0400 in local time, when the sky above the canopy was still completely black. 12 soldiers in total, a mix of Varric personnel and 1 human. They landed in a clearing that the recon maps listed as stable ground, and which turned out on arrival to be ankle-deep mud. Weapons up, comms active, moving immediately. The downed beacon was 4 kilometers to the northeast, behind the forward positions of Resvari forces who had been holding this section of jungle for 3 months and who had earned a reputation for using the terrain as a weapon. They did not fight in open ground if they could help it. They used the jungle the way water uses pipes, flowing through every gap and appearing from angles that made no tactical sense until they were already close enough to matter. Duke moved ahead of the squad from the very first minute. He did not need to be told. Holt gave no command, raised no hand signal, said no word. He simply moved forward to the left flank, and then out ahead, low to the ground, each paw placed with a silence that the squad's best trained scout could not match. His head was down, and his nose was pulling information from the air and the wet soil in a constant stream, reading a version of the jungle that none of the soldiers around him had access to. No instrument in the squad's kit could match what he was doing or do it faster. And said nothing. He had reviewed the pre-mission briefing that Holt delivered the evening before. 12 flat sentences covering what Duke could do, how she communicated with him, and what the squad should do if something in the field went wrong. The briefing had been the most efficient animal overview Zetharak had ever received in 30 years of service. But nothing in those 12 sentences had fully prepared him for watching it happen in real ground conditions. The first warning came 40 minutes into the march. Duke stopped. He did not crouch or signal or make any sound. He simply stopped moving, and in stopping, he became a statue. His tail dropped to a flat horizontal line. His weight shifted slightly back onto his haunches, and he turned his head 20 degrees to the left. Holt raised a closed fist. The squad froze behind her. No one breathed. Nothing moved in the jungle for 30 seconds. Then Zetharak's scanner registered a faint heat signature behind a root cluster, approximately 8 meters to the left. A Resvari scout, stationary, watching the exact path the squad had been about to take through the dark. The squad changed course without a word. Duke moved first, leading them right through a gap in the roots, quiet and steady. The scout never moved, never turned, never knew the squad had passed within meters of his position. This happened 3 more times over the next 2 kilometers. Duke reading the jungle ahead of them the way a trained soldier reads a map that has already been marked with every danger. A chemical trap laid across a game trail, which he identified by stopping and backing up 2 small steps before going around it without hesitation, as though the answer had been obvious. A Resvari sniper positioned high in a branch, 30 meters ahead, which he identified by sitting completely still and tilting his head upward at a specific angle that Holt had told the squad during the briefing meant elevated threat. Look up. Two enemy soldiers sleeping in a carefully concealed position, which he passed at a distance of 4 meters without making a sound and without waking either of them. The alien soldiers stopped watching their instruments, not because they decided to, but because it simply happened. Their eyes drifted to Duke and stayed there, because the instruments were reading numbers, and Duke was reading the actual living jungle around them. And in a place this dark and this alive, the jungle was more useful than the numbers. They reached the beacon at 0612. It was half buried in root growth in a small clearing, its signals still active, but growing weak. 2 soldiers moved in to begin extraction, while the rest took positions around the perimeter. Then the ambush came. It came from the south and east at the same time. Resvari fire teams, 6 soldiers each, moving fast and low through the trees. Plasma rounds cut through the canopy above the squad's heads. Jungle went immediately loud and bright after 40 minutes of complete silence and dark. The transition was violent enough that several soldiers flinched before their training caught up with their bodies. Duke did not wait. He moved before the first exchange of return fire, not charging blindly, not running without direction, moving with the cold and focused purpose of a creature that has done this before and understands exactly what the situation requires. He went south first, hitting the left flank of the first fire team from an angle they were not covering, pressing them into each other with short, explosive contact that broke their formation, and then withdrawing before they could regroup and respond. Then he went wide to the east, circling fast and coming in behind the second team, cutting off their sightline to the squad's exposed right side. He was not trying to destroy them by himself. He was hurting them, pushing them into positions where the squad's weapons could do the work, reading the geometry of the fight as it changed in real time and adjusting every second. Zetharak fired, moved, called directions to his soldiers, kept his awareness spread across the whole clearing, but a part of his attention was always on Duke, because Duke at any given moment was the most accurate picture of where the actual threat was, not because he was reporting it, but because his body was moving through it, and where his body moved told the whole story. Duke took a hit, a glancing plasma graze across his left shoulder, enough heat to singe through the dark fur and leave a visible burn mark on the skin below. He stumbled 1 step, found his footing on the wet ground, and continued moving without slowing. He made no sound at all. Then the fight was over. The Resvari had pulled back into the deeper jungle, 3 of them down, the rest gone. The clearing was quiet again, smelling of burned air and wet soil and the sharp chemical smell that plasma weapons left behind. The squad was intact. The beacon was in the hands of the extraction team, and for a long moment, nobody moved. The debrief room on the Undying Patience was small and smelled like recycled air and cold metal. It had a table, 6 chairs, a recording terminal, and a single window that looked out onto the docking corridor. Standard military issue. The kind of room designed for reporting facts cleanly, and nothing else. The squad filed in 1 by 1 over the course of an hour after returning from Kale 4. Each soldier sat in front of the recording terminal, answered the standard questions in the standard order, filed their official report, and left. The process was supposed to be routine, and from the outside, it looked routine. But Zetharak read each report as it came in, and what he found inside them was not quite what he expected from people who had done routine things. The reports were professional, his soldiers were well trained, and they were always professional. But they were also, in small ways that only a commander who knew his people closely would catch, the edges of language in ways that military reports normally were not. One soldier described Duke as a secondary combatant of unclear classification, which was accurate as far as it went, and also said almost nothing about what had actually happened. Another wrote, a bonded tactical asset, behavior consistent with trained combat support, which was also technically accurate, and also missed most of what the clearing on Kale 4 had actually looked like. Scholar 10, who filed the longest report by a significant margin, and who had spent the entire jungle operation taking quiet mental notes on everything he witnessed, ended his document with a single sentence that read, "Classification unknown. Recommend further study." Which, coming from 10, meant that he had spent every hour since the extraction trying to fit what he had seen into an existing framework, and had found that no existing framework was large enough to hold it. Warlord Sarek filed the shortest report. Sentences. It covered the tactical facts of the operation with complete accuracy and contained no description of Duke at all, as though Sarek had simply decided that certain things did not belong in official documents and had acted on that decision without explanation. Zetharak read all of them twice. Then he set them aside and sat for a while in the quiet of the debrief room. He had his own report to write, and he knew, sitting there with the blank document open on his screen, that it was going to be the most difficult report he had produced in 30 years of service. Not because the facts were complicated, but because the facts were simple and the meaning underneath them was not. And he had always believed that a good report was honest about both layers. Before he started writing, he went to find Corporal Holt. He found her in the medical bay, not being treated herself. She had come through Kale 4 without injury. She was sitting on a bench along the far wall with Duke beside her, while the ship's medical officer applied a regenerative gel treatment to the burn on his left shoulder. The officer was working with efficient, practiced care, and Duke was sitting with the patient stillness of an animal that has learned, through long experience, to trust that the thing being done to him, even when it is uncomfortable, is being done by someone who means well. Holt looked up when Zetharak came through the door. "Commander, Corporal, how is he doing?" "Surface burn. He'll be completely fine within a few days," she said. She glanced at Duke. "He's had worse than this." Zetharak stood in the doorway for a moment. The medical officer finished the treatment, said something quiet to Holt, and left the room. And then it was just the two of them, and the animal between them. Zetharak walked in and sat down in the chair across from the bench. Not something he had planned when he left his office, but which felt like the right thing once he was standing in the room. Duke looked at him with the amber eyes. Then, apparently arriving at some decision on his own, he looked away and rested his wide head on Holt's knee, which Zetharak had come to understand over the past 2 days was as close to a statement of approval as Duke made toward anyone who was not Holt. "I wanted to ask you something," Zetharak said. "Not for the report, just for myself. I want to understand something that I have not been able to work out on my own." Holt nodded. She did not seem surprised. She was resting one hand on Duke's back, not moving it, just resting the weight of it there. A quiet thing, but clearly a thing that meant something to both of them. "Your species," Zetharak said, "humans, you look at animals like this one, animals that are large and powerful and built for things that other species instinctively move away from. And you choose to bring them close to you. You choose to care. For them, you build something together with them that lasts a lifetime. And I want to understand the thinking behind that choice. I want to understand how your people look at something genuinely dangerous and decide to love it." Holt was quiet for a moment. She looked at Duke, not at Zetharak, and her expression was the kind that meant she was not gathering her thoughts, but deciding exactly how honest to be. Then she looked up. "We didn't get close to animals like Duke because we weren't afraid of them," she said. "We got close to them because we were. That's kind of how we do most things." Zetharak looked at her. "I don't follow that. If something is scary," she said, "we want to know why. We want to get close enough to actually understand it. And once we understand it, half the time we find out it wasn't what we thought it was. It was something else. something that was just trying to survive and take care of its own, same as us. Find that out. Once you actually look at the thing directly instead of running from it, it gets hard not to. She paused for a second. It gets hard not to see yourself in it a little. She looked down at Duke, his wide, scarred skull, his patient amber eyes, his enormous, careful body resting still and trusting against her leg. He's not a weapon. He's not a tool. He's just a being that decided somewhere along the way that I was worth protecting, and I decided the same thing about him. And that's the whole thing. That's all of it. Zetharak sat with that for a moment. He had commanded soldiers for 30 years, and had read strategies and studied the histories of 11 species, and learned military doctrines from across the Dominion. And he had never heard 2 sentences describe the full nature of loyalty more simply or more completely than what she had just said to him in a small medical bay that smelled like antiseptic gel. He stood. "Thank you, Corporal. Get some rest. Your transport leaves at 0800. "Yes, sir," she said. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "what he did on Kale 4, I have never seen anything like it, not once in 30 years of field operations." Holt looked at him, and for the first time since she had come aboard the Undying Patience, she smiled. Not the flat professional acknowledgement she had offered in the docking bay, but something real, something that came from a place that actually mattered. "He knows," she said. "He always does." Zetharak nodded once, and left. At 0800 the next morning, the docking bay was quiet. The transport was ready at the collar. Holt stood at the bottom of the ramp with her pack, running through the last equipment checks. Duke sat beside her, in the posture that was simply his posture in any situation. Present, still, watching the room with calm amber eyes. Of the Undying Patience had gathered in the bay, not in any formation, and not on any order from Zetharak. They had simply arrived, in ones and twos, and stood along the walls, the way people stand when they are not entirely sure why they came, but feel that it matters that they did. Sarek was there with his arms folded, and his back straight. Ten was there, holding his datapad that he was not writing on. Vex was there, and near the back, standing quietly by himself, was the young soldier named Weth, the same Weth who had raised his weapon in this same bay 2 days before. He was not raising anything now. Holt finished her checks and looked up at the crew gathered along the walls. She raised one hand in a simple farewell. Duke, at the top of the ramp, turned and looked back at the bay, at the soldiers along the walls, at the wide gray space that had briefly been part of his world. His amber eyes moved across the room, one final time, with the same slow, methodical, the attention they had used when he first came down that ramp and decided whether this place and these beings met his standards. Then he turned and walked into the transport. The ramp closed. The transport released from the docking collar and moved out through the bay doors and into the open dark. The bay stayed quiet for a long time. That evening, Commander Zetharak sat at his desk with the Varek Dominion Species Threat Registry open on his screen. The registry was the oldest document maintained by High Command, updated continuously over 400 years of expansion and first contact. A running record of every civilization the Dominion had encountered and what that civilization represented in the larger picture. Most entries were straightforward and clean: ally, neutral, contested, threat. The categories were sufficient for most things the Dominion had encountered in 4 centuries of reaching outward. There was one category that had remained completely empty for all 400 years. A category created by the founders of the Dominion for civilizations that could not be placed inside the standard framework. Civilizations too layered, and too contradictory, and too genuinely difficult to hold inside a single word without losing something important about what they actually were. Zetharak opened that category. He typed a single word: humanity. He sat back and looked at it on the screen for a long time. Then he leaned forward again. Below the first entry, he added a second line, a sub-entry, a thing he was not certain the registry software was designed to allow, but which the software permitted without complaint, appearing cleanly on the screen beneath the first.